pretty good. Okay, oops. So in all of the traits Mendel studied, so he crossed purple with white, pure breeding purple with pure breeding white. He crossed pure breeding green with pure breeding yellow. He crossed pure breeding tall plants with pure breeding short plants. And the next generation had only one version of the trait. Okay, so in the example we have in the picture here, he crossed pure breeding purple flowers with pure breeding white flowers. The next generation, all purple. And not light purple, just as exactly as purple as the purple parent was. This would later be called, he didn't use this word, but later we learned that, or applied a word to it, we call this the dominant version of the trait. Then he crossed those offspring with each other, right? So he crossed the pure breeding ones with each other. Their offspring were called the hybrids. Then he let them cross with each other. And then in the next generation, the one that had disappeared, there was none of this trait in the first round of offspring, reappeared in 25% of the offspring. So the version of the trait that could disappear and then reappear in a later generation is called the recessive version. Okay, so if we look at this picture down here, again we have purple flowers and white flowers. This is called the P generation, or the parental generation. Their offspring are called F1, or the hybrids, and they all just have one trait. This happens to be for flower color, but it was the same pattern for every trait. Only one version of the trait showed up. And the F1's kids are called the F2, and there's that 25% showed the version of the trait that had disappeared. So let's just get those names recorded down here. So the original parents, Mendel called the P generation, or the parent generation. Their offspring are called the F1. The F stands for filial. And I always think I need to look this up. It's either Latin or Greek. I couldn't tell you which one. Which it just means son or daughter. So we have the first kind of round of sons and daughters. And then the offspring of F1, not cleverly, are called the F2, or second filial generation. So how does this work? So this whole page is nothing that Mendel had figured out. We kind of have used observations and done tons and tons of science, and now we have the how it works that Mendel did not have. So genes are sections of DNA with instructions for a trait. So if I had a big string of DNA over here, right, maybe from here to here for a pea plant is instructions for flower color. All right, so this little segment of DNA that has instructions for flower color would be the flower color gene. But again, the trait is the category. It doesn't say whether it's instructions for making purple flowers or instructions for making white flowers. The different versions of the trait we call alleles. So for this gene, it could have the purple flower allele, so it would have instructions for making purple flowers, or it could have the white flower allele, instructions for making white flowers. So again, the version that showed up is called the dominant, since they are strong enough to cover up the other version. If instructions from either parent are for the dominant trait, that one will be expressed. When we're talking about dominant alleles, we always represent them with a capital letter. And we usually pick whatever letter that version of the trait starts with. So like purple flowers are dominant over white flowers in pea plants, so we use capital P to represent the allele for purple flowers. And the versions of the trait that disappear, again, are called recessive. These versions of a trait only show up if instructions from both parents tell the organism to express it. And not surprisingly, we're going to represent them with a lowercase letter, but here's the thing, it's the same letter as the dominant one. So we don't use, you know, capital P for white, lowercase w, or sorry, we do not use capital P for purple, lowercase w for white. We still use P. P for both the dominant and the recessive. So we would use, you know, capital P for purple up here for the dominant, and lowercase also P to represent the white allele. Okay, we have, sorry, my cat's being weird over here, a couple other ideas here. We have the law of segregation that says when making gametes, which remember is just our fancy word for egg and sperm, each allele a parent has a 50% chance of being put into any particular gamete. So, what does that look like? It might look like this. Okay, so maybe one, you know, an adult pea plant has a purple allele and a white allele, right? So let's say here's a bunch of eggs they make. Okay, let's say they make 12 eggs. Okay, half of them are going to get capital P's. And the other half are going to get lowercase p's. Okay, so that's a law of segregation. Each allele that a parent has a 50% chance of being put into each gamete. If they have all two of the same, obviously they're all their eggs are going to get the same version. But the idea is it's just kind of random chance if they get this one or this one. All right, second law, the law of independent assortment. Okay, it says each gene is independent and does not affect the probability of others. So basically, a couple of the genes we'll talk about a lot for pea plants are like flower color and height. Okay, so this is the idea that, you know, just because pea gets the genetic instructions for being purple does not make it any more or less likely to get the genetic instructions for being tall. They're completely independent. They do not affect each other. Okay, so these two words are going to come up a lot, so pay attention here. We have the genetic instructions are called genotype, and the physical version of a trait they display is called the phenotype. So the easiest way to think about this is genotype sounds like gene, so that's the genes, that's the instructions. And phenotype, I know it starts with a PH, but so does physical. They both start with the same sound, same two letters. Phenotype is what's physically showing up. We're going to have a little bit of practice with this down here at the bottom of the page. If a genotype has two identical alleles, we call it homozygous. Remember, in science or really anywhere, the prefix homo means same. And so if it has two different alleles, we call it heterozygous. I would really encourage you to hit pause right here and see if you can't figure out how to fill out this table by yourself. But, you know, I can't really make sure you do that, so we're just going to kind of power forward here. So if the genotype is capital T, I'll tell you the capital T is for the dominant version of the trait, which is tall. And lowercase t, remember we use lowercase of the same letter, must be the allele for the recessive version, which is short. So if the genotype is big T, it got a tall allele from mom and a tall allele from dad, the phenotype, the physical thing we would see, is a tall plant. And the homozygous or heterozygous, if we look back at the alleles, we have two identical alleles, capital T, so it must be homozygous. Alright, so this one is also tall. Okay, so the question is what possible genotype that we don't already have here would produce tall? and it is big T, little t. So remember, for the dominant allele, you only need one of them. So if 2 T's gives you tall, so does just 1 T. But now these two alleles are different from each other, so we'd say this is heterozygous. And little t, they're identical to each other, but neither one is instructions for the dominant allele, so we can show the recessive version. So this would be a short plant, but they are the same, so it's homozygous. And again, we will stop there. I'll just kind of do this in 2-page segments, I think.